So this is what I've got planned. There's a lot there, and some of it will take a short amount of time and others will take a little bit of time. I'm really aware that we've only got an hour and a half, and from the other training sessions I've done, we do run out of time. So I guess in some ways take advantage of the conversational approach that we're taking and ask questions as they come to mind. And if I know that it's coming forward later on in the discussion, I'll let you know. So I'm going to quickly run through a summary of ethics at UQ just to kind of lay the groundwork. And then I'd really like to introduce you, if you're not aware, to the national statement and the 4 ethical principles which guide our work in this space. Then I'm going to go through definitions of low and negligible risk research and high risk research, because depending on how your research is defined depends on how it's reviewed and the kinds of information that you'll need to take on board and consider and include in your application. And then, as I mentioned earlier, based on my discussions with Dennis and Kelly, I wanted to just alert you to some ethical considerations that I think are important when doing social media research, interviews and focus groups, observations and ethnography, including autoethnography. If we get time, I'll run through some information sheets and consent forms. I know that Tharuka from the Office of Research Ethics is really keen to share some common pitfalls when applying for ethics and how to avoid them. We've got a really short video grab of the Office of Research Ethics and one of the high-risk ethical review committees, our top 10 tips for applying for ethics, and of course we'll have time for question and answer. So let's get going. But first, I would like to, some of you may or may not know me. My name's Liz McKinlay. I work in the School of Education. I'm currently chair of the HAS Low and Negligible Risks Committee and chair of one of the high risk ethical review committees at central level. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Tharuka from the Office of Research Ethics. Tharuka has recently joined the team. Tharuka, would you like to say anything? Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Liz. Yeah, so I think some of you have emailed me as well. So I'm the ethics coordinator for HAS LNR applications. So if you do have any questions related to the application, ethics application, you can direct me. I mean, you can email me and then I will try to help. So I come from humanities education background as well, and I recently joined this position and I'm enjoying it at the moment. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks, Tharuka. It's been great working with you so far, and I know we have lots of plans for training and education and top tips and things like that. So watch this space as Tharuka and I get our skates on and share some information with you. So I'll very quickly go through the history and background to ethics at UQ. I think this is kind of important to put things in perspective, mostly because to alert you to the fact that ethics is not set in stone. It is actually a really rapidly changing landscape for lots of reasons. In Australia, let's just have a quick look and think around the fact that prior to 1983, we don't have a ratified national set of standards or an ethical statement. Everyone at this point is relying on ethics being a researcher's responsibility, and certainly when I began my work in the early 90s, there were no ethical clearance processes for me to follow, no application forms, no review, which for me often is quite astounding when I think about the fact that I was working in Indigenous communities and I could simply arrive without any going through any review by an ethical committee at university or indeed by an Aboriginal community. And that's a topic for another discussion. And then to also let you know that after 1983 is when we start to get some kind of national approach to ethics. And it's not until 1996, however, that we have a Commonwealth review of ethics committee set in place, and we start to get some traction in terms of a national approach to ethical standards and what it is we're required to do. And of course, we have the latest NHMRC statement, which came out in 2018. The statement is constantly updated as it needs to be as the research landscape changes and shifts. And there's the link. I've got another link for you, but if you haven't seen the national statement and haven't looked at it, I'd really strongly encourage you to download it and have it handy for when you're applying for ethics. In terms of UQ, some of you may or may not be aware of the history of ethics at UQ. So prior to 2015, around the university, we had something like 35 different review processes, all of them operating under different kinds of reviewing committees and structures, different kinds of forms. And the university decided that we needed to have a bit of a look at quality and whether we were up to national standards. And the recommendation from that was that we needed to establish a central HREC as well as streamline low and negligible risk applications at the faculty level. So 2016, there were a few of us who got together at central level and put together some processes, including the low and negligible risk committees at faculty. And so by 2017, we had the 2 central HRECs established, and the LNR model has slowly been rolled out across every faculty at the university. And of course, the other big move is that everybody is now using the one national form, which is the HREA. And we're going to talk a bit about that later. In terms of the UQ context, I also just wanted to share with you some policies that are significant for us to, again, have handy and to be aware of. There's the national statement, there's the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research, there's a UQ policy on the responsible conduct of research, and then there are the GERA's guidelines for working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which comes out of the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. So they're 4 key documents, which I think are really helpful and obviously essential for us when we're applying for ethics. Tharuka, I might ask you to speak to this slide if you like. This is something that's coming out of the Office of Research Ethics, and it relates to the My Research platform and the way that ethical clearance processes will be handled by this new system.
Yeah, Liz, thank you. So just a quick update that it's soon going to be in the transition stage where there will be a cutoff date for everyone to apply for LNR applications or HREC applications. And after that cutoff date, there will be a break where you won't be able to submit any applications until the new system comes in. So we will keep all of you informed. Even we still don't know when exactly that date is, but what we know is it's going to happen soon. So if you do have any ethics applications to be submitted, it's best to do it soon, but you don't have to rush as well. But yeah, just letting you know, that's all we know at the moment. And it's just going to have just one platform for everybody to access applications and do everything hereafter. Yeah. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks, Tharuka. So it'll be, as the slide indicates, that My Research will be a one-stop shop for your application, any ratifications that are attached to it, exemptions or amendments, as well as your annual final report. We do have HREC members have a training session on this. We don't quite yet know what the platform looks like from our perspectives as reviewers yet. So hopefully we can iron out some of the bugs and the problems before it gets to you as the end users and applying for ethics. So just to take you to the national statement, and maybe you'd like to open this up while I'm speaking, but the national statement has a number of aims that I think are important for us just to remember. The first is overarchingly to promote ethically good human research, which in this sense relates to the fact of trying to accord participants the respect and protection that is due to them, as well as fostering research that is of benefit to the community. And sometimes I think we forget that this national statement, I know that it comes out of the Medical Research Council, but it was developed in association with the Australian Research Council and Universities Australia. So it does take a holistic view of research. This national statement itself is really clearly designed to clarify the responsibilities of institutions and researchers, as well as review bodies in the design, conduct and dissemination of results relating and involving human participants. And it's also designed to assist institutions, researchers and review bodies to meet their responsibilities in relation to that. So of course, for each category, there'll be slightly different issues that arise. So for researchers and institutions, it's about identifying issues of ethics that arise in the design, review and conduct of human research. And for review bodies, it's about deliberating upon those ethical issues and justifying decisions about them. I guess one of the things that I really want to impress upon you is becoming familiar with the guiding 4 principles that are associated and outlined in the national statement. The first of these is research merit and integrity, and this means that in terms of looking at projects involving human beings, we're thinking around whether or not the research is worthwhile and whether it has value to community and humanity as a whole. There's a really long history to why these 4 principles are there, but I guess at the heart of it, one of the things that we're being asked to do as reviewers and as researchers is to consider this idea of research being of value. And the old kind of chestnut of research for research's sake or research for knowledge's sake just doesn't cut it anymore. So that's one of the first principles. The second one is respect for human beings, and this is underpinning this is the understanding that every single person, human being, has value in and of themselves. The third principle is beneficence, which is the obligation that we have as researchers to maximise the possible benefits for participants in research and minimise the possible harms, with the ideal being to do no harm. And in any ethical clearance project and any ethics associated with research, we're looking at the ways that we can balance this. Benefits and harm are always taken in balance with one another, and I'll talk about that in a moment when we look at levels of risk. The fourth principle relates to justice, and this is understanding that every single human shares the same kinds of rights and the same rights in terms of thinking around access to research and the results of research. So the benefits from research under this category, justice, are achieved through just means, meaning that there is procedural justice, fair treatment of people equally across participant groups, and also that there's distributive justice, which means that all people are given access to the research in fair and equitable ways. And when we're looking at reviewing applications, particularly at central level, it's these 4 principles that guide our way of assessing an application. And we'd encourage you as people applying for research that it's these 4 principles that you need to be sitting with you when you're responding to the HREA form and thinking about your project. Every single question on the HREA form is designed with these 4 principles in mind. And if you approach the HREA form thinking about these 4 principles, you're going to be able to give us the appropriate detail that we need to assess the ethical parameters of the work that you're wanting to do. I'm not sure if are there any questions so far? I haven't been keeping an eye on the chat.
Yes, so some of them have been telling that the links are not accessible, linkable. So they're asking for the national statement copy. So I just sent the link and the PDF version of it just now.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm sorry about that. So thinking about levels of review is inherently linked to risk. And as you would probably be aware, we have 2 categories of risk in relation to research involving human participants. Just waiting for my computer to wake up. The first is low or negligible risk. Let me take you through that. Low risk research describes research in which the only foreseeable risk is one of discomfort. And so, for example, a really kind of basic project that might involve low risk is if you're asking someone to sit for any length of time to play a video game, and say you want them to sit playing a video game for 3 hours non-stop. You could imagine that the discomfort that someone is going to experience, they'll get stiff, they might get hungry, they might get thirsty, they might need to go to the toilet. So there's a physical discomfort that sits there. There are other kinds of discomforts as well, which include psychological, which we need to take into account. But certainly we're talking about a very low level of discomfort here. The second is negligible risk research, which describes research in which there is no foreseeable risk of harm or discomfort. And any foreseeable risk is no more than inconvenience. And often when we're thinking about the kinds of work that we might be doing, particularly if we're doing, say, interview work or observation work, usually the inconvenience relates to time and the burden of time. So we're asking someone to leave home to come to the university to participate in whatever the project is that we have running. So the inconvenience in coming to the university would be having to park, for example. If you're wanting to interview people in the context of education where I'm often working, we often want to interview teachers, and the inconvenience is on teachers' time and teachers being time poor and having an overcrowded curriculum in classrooms. So negligible risk often is thinking around what is the inconvenience, how am I asking a particular person to step outside of their daily routine to work with me. As I mentioned earlier, when we're thinking about levels of risk, it's always about taking into account the kinds of harm, discomfort or inconvenience that might occur, the likelihood that these things will happen, and then thinking around the severity of any harm that may occur as a result. Keep in mind that it is possible to have risk and it is possible to have harm. The most important thing that we need to be assured of is that you understand what those harm, discomforts and inconveniences might be, and that you have in place processes for managing them or mitigating them. So we see applications all of the time of low or negligible risk as well as high risk, and it's really about this balance between how can I ensure that I am minimising harm for benefit of the participant and of course the project as a whole. So the definition of high risk, I guess, is pretty simple in some ways. It means that whatever the research is that you're doing has potential to cause harm to participants. And there are many different types of harms that we need to think about. So we have physical harms, which of course relates to injury, illness and pain. Psychological harms could be feelings of worthlessness, distress, guilt, anger, fear, which for example might be related to the disclosure of sensitive or embarrassing information, or learning about a genetic possibility of developing an untreatable disease, just to throw a quite unusual one in there. The devaluation of personal worth is one of the harms that we take into account, and this might be in relation to being humiliated or manipulated in other ways and therefore treated disrespectfully or unjustly. Social harms relate to the damage to social networks or relationships with others in relation to their participation in a project. It could be result in things like discrimination in access to benefits, services, employment or insurance, as well as different kinds of social stigmatisation if people know that you've been participating. Economic harms can relate to imposition of direct or indirect costs on participants. So parking, I guess, is a very mild form of a cost and a harm. But I guess one of the things that could happen is that in high risk research is if you're, for example, working with employees of a company and you're asking them to, you're assessing particular kinds of management practices, and employees tell you things that don't put management in a particularly good light, and management finds out that a participant has shared that information and been involved in the research, then I guess potentially the participant, there could be all kinds of ramifications, the worst of course being loss of employment. And then there are legal harms, which relates to the discovery and prosecution of criminal conduct. And so you'll know that if you've filled out an ethical clearance application form previously, you'll know that there's a category of research which will involve the people who are involved in illegal activity of some kind. And we need to think about our responsibilities to report when we find instances of criminal conduct. In relation to high risk research, so we have the particular kinds of harms that I've mentioned here, but then we also have special categories of participant where it's recognised that particular groups are perhaps more vulnerable to harm. And so at the moment, the categories of participant are women who are pregnant and the human fetus, children and young people, people in dependent or unequal relationships, people highly dependent on medical care who are unable to give consent, people with a cognitive impairment, intellectual disability or mental illness, people who are involved in illegal activities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and people in other countries. This list of special categories of participant is currently under review by the NHMRC, and there's certain categories which I'm anticipating, and we're anticipating the Office of Research Ethics that may or may no longer continue to be on this list. For example, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as a special category. Just by the fact of being an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people doesn't necessarily put you in at risk of greater harm, and neither does being a woman who is pregnant. Typically what happens if you are working with one of these special categories of participant, your application is immediately bumped up from low or negligible risk to high risk, which means it's reviewed not at the faculty level, but at central level. But of course, each one of these, each application and the kinds of participants that you're working with are taken as individual cases. So just because you're working in another country doesn't mean that your application is automatically high risk, but certainly each case is taken on its merits. But just be aware that if you are working with any one of those special categories of participant, there's a strong likelihood that your application will be bumped up to Central Committee for review. Does anyone have any questions about risk or categories of participant before I move on to thinking around particular kinds of research processes and ethical considerations?
Liz, I had a question.
Yes.
So because I supervise the master's thesis and research project courses at the School of Communication, I may have a case where we've got a large external student body in China, and they want to do their thesis project in China, interviewing participants from China for their study because they're not in Australia anymore. Would that then go to the Central Committee, even though it's a student project?
Potentially, yes. There are a number of different things that we would be thinking about. Is firstly, in what social context and cultural context in China are the participants located? And the reason I ask that is we may need some kind of gatekeeper approval from an organisation or an institution, depending on where the participants are located, for that research to take place. If the student is very familiar with working in the context of China, speaks Chinese, for example, is from China, and can demonstrate their familiarity with the cultural context and protocols that are important to take on board, then it may not be the case that it needs high risk review. I mean, in that instance where you've got someone from China, speaks the language, knows the context, knows the protocols and can demonstrate that, and they're, say, interviewing first year university students about their experiences in first semester and transitioning from high school. I mean, that's a fairly low risk application. And so when I say that we take things on their merit, that would be the kind of thing that we would be looking for. And just to be aware that if your application, when you're applying, if you indicate that it's low or negligible risk, and the Office of Research Ethics looks at it and they think, oh, we're not sure about this, they'll usually discuss that with the chair, and we'll have a look at that and make a determination of whether we think it's low or negligible risk or whether it needs to go up to the Central Committee for review. But also vice versa. If you indicate you'd like high risk review because of something like working with people in another country, if the application comes to Central, as chair, one of my roles is to review, do a kind of first cut review of all the applications that we're looking at that month. And if we think, actually, this is not high risk review, we'll bump it back down to low to the LNR committee. So we do make sure that before we go through the reviewing process, we've already had a look to see what the parameters are and which committee would be most appropriate. Because I guess at one level, we're trying to be enabling in the ethics office. So we'd like to enable research to happen efficiently and quickly, and of course ethically. And also from the central committee, we don't want to kind of clog up our meeting time with applications that we didn't need to be reviewing at all. So we're trying to be efficient in that way.
Thank you for that. It's very helpful. Do you know, just for my information only, if an application does, hypothetically speaking, go to central, would that take a couple of weeks for a turnaround?
That's a really good question, but a really hard one to answer. So just for those of you who aren't aware of how the central committees work, we have 2 committees. Every committee meets individually once a month, but we dovetail, so every 2 weeks. And on the Office of Research Ethics website, you'll see the cut-off dates for applications for each committee. So every 2 weeks, the ethics committees at central level are meeting. Once your application goes to one committee, it stays with that committee until it's done and dusted. And I guess it's fair to say that 9 times out of 10, we do need to see applications again at central committee. We rarely approve straight away, but in terms of the kinds of review and resubmission and work that needs to be done for clearance, that can depend. So if you've done a really high quality application and there are only a number of different queries that the ethics committee have, it means that your application doesn't need to come back to the committee, so you don't need to wait another month. You can respond via email, and myself as chair and whoever the spokespeople are for that particular application will review it. So it's likely then that it could be maybe a 2-week turnaround if your application's in good shape. So at central level, we have, it's a legally constituted committee, which includes 2 lay people, a core group of researchers, a religious, spiritual counselling representative, a lawyer, as well as people who were in the care profession. And so we have a number of different eyes over it. And at the moment, the UQ approach to central reviewing is that we have the chairperson plus 3 spokespeople who give their kind of initial feedback on the application, and then we open it up to the committee for discussion. Okay. That's how reviewing happens. If your application requires substantial reworking, and we have a lot of questions, many of them serious, then it will come back to the committee for review, a second review. It's not unusual for us to look at applications 2 or 3 times at central level, but we're really hoping that through training sessions like this, we can avoid that time lag.
Thank you, Liz. That's very helpful, because our projects normally are completed over 1 semester only. So it will be a very tight time frame if they have to start and finish a project in 13 weeks and get approvals, plus the new deadlines for even the LNR submissions, which would kick in 2021. Hopefully they coincide with the semester dates.
Yeah, and that's certainly something, Thurika, maybe we could just make a note of that and ensure
Yes, I took a note as well. And then just to clarify, it's not just the LNR, it's for full committee applications and everything. The entire system will shut down at one point and then go to the new system.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I'm going to make a disclaimer before I start talking about social media research and say, as many of you would know, this is a rapidly changing landscape in terms of the kinds of research that people are doing, the ways that platforms are shifting and moving very, very quickly, and the ways that users are interacting. So anything that I say here shouldn't be taken as a golden rule, but just suggestions and questions to be asking as you're thinking about the kind of social media research that you'll be doing. And from my perspective, I guess I have very firmly the ethics hat on and thinking around that principle of how do we ensure that whatever research we're doing is not doing any harm to participants. And of course the researchers themselves, but that idea of doing no harm and beneficence and justice, respect, research merit, integrity, they're all sitting there. I probably don't need to give you a definition, just as an indication. Could people give me a thumbs up if you are doing social media research or looking at doing social media research? A couple of you. Yep. So I guess one of the things that's really significant about social media research is that it's driven by various kinds of users and communication to a broad audience, and that occurs at the interactions that are happening are occurring at many, many different levels in various ways, public and private. All kinds of things are going on, and they're meeting different kinds of social needs. Thinking about the kinds of things that we're looking at when we're thinking about ethics and social media research, I guess there are 3 points I'd just like to make. Is that if I'm thinking of my research as social media, it would be asking the question, whatever I'm using, does it have the capability to support user-generated content, which might be texts, posts, videos, statuses, things like that? Does it provide a means for users to connect? And does it support various means for members to engage in community building, participant interaction and sharing and linking up? So I know that there are others of you who are more familiar with social media research, but from an ethics point of view, this is the way we're thinking about it. We're trying to think about how are human beings engaging in these places and what does that mean for us ethically? I'm just going to have a quick look. Okay, someone's asking about an ethics application, but I might leave that just float along in the chat if that's okay. It's true to say that when we get to ethics, there are many, many complexities in the social media research space. So the first one that I'd like you to just to think about is the volume, the variety, the virtue of the kinds of things that we're looking at, the data that's available on social media and the value, the veracity of it. You know, we know that data is produced very, very quickly. It's all happening at rapid speed, and just thinking about those things is significant for us in terms of trying to think around what it is we're going to be trying to get access to and to use in our projects. The fact that social media data is often more public available raises, I guess, 2 kinds of questions. And one is, or one question really, but does it mean that we require more rigorous ethical clearance processes or considerations of ethics, or does it mean that there are less ethical considerations we need to take into account? And I guess there is no, the blurred lines between public and private make this even more tricky. For example, you know, you could ask the question around, is the data truly public? And I'm sure you'd be like social networking sites versus Twitter. Is there a sense that all of it is public or only some? And if you want to use a post from a particular person, how do we think around whether they want that to be publicly available or used, or whether they would prefer it to be kept private even though they've posted it publicly? So there's a real blurring between public and private status of data, if you like. I guess too, the other complexity is that there is no checklist in relation to ethics and social media research, but I guess there are 2 things that we probably need to be thinking about. The first is what constitutes consent when we're looking at social media research. And also this idea that because it's publicly posted and it's available, one of the things that we can't be sure of is, or we need to have some sense of surety, is around are users consenting to their data being used by researchers in ways that they didn't predict when they signed up to use a social media platform? And we need to think about how and where is the traditional standard of informed consent applied in social media research. And the other complexity that comes to consent, of course, is that the network nature of the data that people are sharing on social media network means that consent from one person doesn't necessarily transcend to the others who might be interacting with them. The other issue is, of course, the issue of anonymity and the right of users to protect their privacy. And then, of course, on the flip side to that, the ability for us to draw conclusions from anonymous data. And one of the other kind of things that I think floats in and around using social media research is the level of trust that usually exists between a researcher and the people that we're working with. There's a relationship of trust that's there, and thinking around how we ensure that that is enacted and performed and transparent in terms of social media research is a complexity. And I don't have any answers for any of this. These are just some questions I think are important for us to be considering as we're doing this work. So I'll just go to then thinking around 3 areas of concern, and I've already talked about a number of them. The first is the idea of informed consent. So you know that this is one of the overarching principles that speaks directly to each of the 4 national statement ethical principles. So first of all, I guess in relation to informed consent, often we need to think about the ways we're accessing data on social media research. So, often we're actually accessing and using data without getting consent first, not in the usual processes. When we do an interview with participants, we're usually asking them first for consent. The other thing around informed consent in social media research is that participants are often rarely aware of their participation. So they're actually participating in research because we can watch and look and take and observe and collect without people realising it. Informed consent, as some of us would know, is really difficult with big data sets. And there's also a problem around the conflation of informed consent as the same as an agreement to the terms of use of a social media platform. And so thinking around what the difference is when somebody signs up and creates an account on Facebook versus agreeing to research is really important, particularly if we think that many users do not read the terms of agreement when we sign up. So the other issue is something that we often look for in research projects is around whether or not we're giving participants capacity to withdraw. For whatever reason, they decide they don't want to participate any longer. And right to withdraw in social media research is actually quite difficult. So for example, if someone decides to delete a post, does that constitute withdrawal from a project? The next issue is anonymity. And this is not straightforward by any means because of the different ways that people make their identity public, private, and anywhere in between. If we're using big data sets from social media research, it's actually really difficult to anonymise individual extracts. And also some platforms, depending on what we're using, insist on using units of data in their original form and attributed to an original, the person who originally posted it. And then anonymity gets a little bit more complicated depending on the type of data that we're using. So text, image and video, of course, have different issues around anonymity. The next, the third concern that I wanted to draw your attention to is the risk of harm. And in most instances, the harm that we're speaking about is where a social media's users' privacy and anonymity are breached. And of course, this can be, the harm can be greater when we're dealing with more sensitive data. If you remember earlier, I talked about the idea of a social harm being, or devaluation of personal worth being the risk of embarrassment, reputational damage or prosecution, which would be a legal harm. And so thinking around the level of harm and the risk of harm is important because usually in an informed consent process, we tell participants what the harm is. If you're likely to participate in this project, these are the risks. And if you're happy with those risks and you're prepared to take the risk that this could happen to you and you consent to that, then we can, the research can proceed. when we're looking at social media research, a difficulty with consent and understanding harm and then agreeing to participate is, for example, that we cannot always be sure whether a person on a social media site is an adult, that we don't know whether we're dealing with children. And the other aspect that can be difficult is how can we be sure that a person is actually of sound mind or capacity to give consent. So there are three issues that I think, again, we need to take on board. But I've been trying to think of, now that I've raised all the questions and the challenges and the concerns, I guess, well, we need some kind of way forward. And I think this framework is one that I have begged and borrowed from the University of Aberdeen. They've got a project which is related to new social media, new social science, and sorry, I'm just flipping to my notes on this one. But I guess some of these things are a bit of a no-brainer in some ways. So first, of course, is thinking around, does your research involve social media data? So going back and looking at the types of social media that you might be using, the kinds of data that you're going to be collecting, and making some determination about how you're going to adequately describe that. When you're applying for ethics in relation to social media, giving the detail of this is really, really important, particularly because this is very much at the cutting edge of a lot of research that we're seeing coming through, and we really need to have a good description of it. Once you've made that determination, the next thing is to think around the legal aspects of the social media sites that you're wanting, or platforms that you're wanting to look at. And so it's really important that you consult the terms and conditions of the specific platform itself. And then you also do that in conversation with the relevant disciplinary, funding, legal and institutional guidelines that are around. And in your application to us as reviewing bodies, that you detail this for us, that you spell it out. Otherwise, we will come back and ask you, what does the fine print say? What does the user agreement say in relation to each in relation to the platform that you want. The next category to think around is privacy and risk. And I guess the questions that you might ask here is thinking about, can the social media platform, or the user of a particular social media platform, could they reasonably be expected to be observed by strangers? Are the research participants vulnerable in any kind of way to any kind of harm that we've talked about already? Is the subject matter of your research and or the social networking site or whatever it is that you're looking at, is it sensitive? And then thinking around, we'd always ask you to think around, is informed consent possible? Is it possible that I can get consent? How might I do that? And to be thinking creatively and imaginatively about that. So for example, I know that in some research applications we've seen to use Reddit, just as to pull one out of a hat, where we've been talking to researchers about using e-consent and ways you might do that, that satisfies all of the boxes we like to see ticked in relation to the capacity for participants to be well informed and to have agency to give consent. The next thing is about the reuse and publication of the data that you're going to be taking from a social media platform and users, and how are you going to anonymise that? How can you be sure that a person's identity is protected so that we minimise the harms? And also looking through, all of these things are kind of linked up together, because there might be some fine print from a platform, a social media platform, in the user agreement around how you can publish or share the data set. So all of these things need to be taken into account in conversation with one another. And this is the sort of detail we would love to see to help us understand the parameters of the work that you're doing, the kind of data that you're collecting, and the ways you're thinking about those three areas of concern, which are informed consent, anonymity, and risk of harm. And please remember that everything here that I've shared with you are guidelines. They're not rules, but they're ways that we think might be helpful for you to frame your application and make sure we get a really good grounding in understanding the ethical parameters of what it is that you're wanting to do. I might just pause there just to ask if there are any questions from anyone.
Liz, I'm going to give you a kind of an example of for one of my students who'll be coming up to applying for ethics. So she's going to be looking at, women who are in rural areas who use Instagram to communicate, publicly. They have public, Instagram accounts about climate change, and looking at the kind of the ways in which, the sort of themes that come out of that climate change those Instagram messages. In a sense, I think if you've got I'm in my mind, tell me whether this makes sense to you. I'm thinking that if you've got a public account where you are actually kind of communicating about specific issues, then to do a project that looks at the way that people are communicating about that issue, I think you could argue for implied consent, because you're putting it out into the public sphere. People can share or read and share and do whatever they want with the kind of, the messages that you're putting through that platform. And so I just wonder if that's, if you were reading that application, do you think that would be a kind of a fair argument to make?
I think it would be, actually, because if you think about the idea of, the intention that sits behind the post, and the intention actually is to make their point of view public. And they're intending for people to look at it, read it, and access it. And I think that's the argument that you would definitely make. And so one of the things that you might want to do, however, though, you assume that consent is there because they've signed up. This is a public site. It's about public activism or whatever. The intention is to share the information anyway to anyone who wants to access it. But what you still might want to do is consider, is there anything I can do around anonymity? That would be, maybe there's not. Maybe it's important that someone is known, but and maybe there's already one step towards anonymity depending on the kind of username or whatever someone's using. But I guess it's thinking around those three aspects of informed consent, anonymity, and the risk of harm. And the harm one is actually, I think, something to really take on board, because if you think around, if I reshare this information that's already publicly available, this person has already, gone out on a limb, been brave, and shared their viewpoint with the world. What is there risk, reputational damage, the kinds of harm that we talked about, embarrassment? That's another one, but I think you could probably make a good argument. It would, to make that argument, and this is another thing I usually make sure I impress upon everyone, is to give us the detail. So if you're accessing a particular site or Instagram post, whatever it is, make sure you tell us exactly what it is. Give us the link so we can see it, but share with us the detail, because without that, if someone just said, oh, I'm using a social networking site around environmental activism, we really don't, that doesn't tell us anything. And I guess the other thing to be aware of, and it's in our top 10 tips, but is the detail that you provide is all that we have to assess your application. So if you've missed out something, we can't assess it. So give us all the detail and think around that idea of informed consent, anonymity, and risk of harm. And I guess that idea of, if someone's posting on social media, they're really, you would think, in the way that you've just described, they are quite aware of their level of participation. They want people to see it. They want people to access it. So making the argument around that as implied consent would be good for us to see.
Liz, just to add to that, so what happens if it's a YouTube video that the researcher is observing, including where the video has children or something? How do we go about that kind of? Does it fall under still implied consent because it's public, or?
Oh, that's a really difficult one. And the rules around working with children is another session, really. But we would be looking really closely at the way that you're sharing with us the level of harm And we'd want to be thinking around, the type of material that it is. Is it of a sensitive nature? What is the capacity to cause harm to a child? What is the capacity for it to, in the collecting of the data and then the sharing and reuse of that data, for anonymity to be protected or identity to be protected? But that would, if you're doing that kind of research, YouTube clips with children, that would definitely be a high risk review, because we'd want to just make sure that we've really understood the nature of the research, the nature of the data, the nature of children's participation, and the level of harm.
Aparna had a question, another kind of scenario, you know, somebody wants to analyse Scott Morrison's Twitter feed and the public's comments, how do we think about that? I mean, in my mind, you know, like if you're if you're the Prime Minister and you've got a, Twitter account, then like you're wanting to put your message out there via the social media platform. I suppose that it's the sort of responses that might be something you have to think about, the people who've responded. I mean, Twitter, of course, does have its rules, and its agreement says that, the data can be used, I think, for research. But anyway, your thoughts, Liz, rather than my thoughts.
I don't think there's any problem with republishing or reproducing Scott Morrison's comments on Twitter. I mean, if we think around a Twitter feed, 20 years ago, a Twitter feed would have been a journalist, recording Scott Morrison's comment in a newspaper article, which you could access. So that's perfectly okay. In terms of the public's comments, again, though, I guess it is going back to that, the informed consent. Well, they're on Twitter, they know that their comments can be used for research, but then it's taking into account the other two areas of concern, the anonymity, if it's possible for you to anonymise the data, and what does that mean for the reliability of the data, or the truth of the data, if you want to call it that, and then the risk of harm if you do or you don't. So it's always the balance there, and it's difficult to give a exact kind of one-size-fits-all response to that, because of course it's going to depend on, we think of the risk of harm, it's always about the sensitive nature of the material and the kinds of harm that could result from it. Is that helpful, Kelly?
Aparna's got a follow-up, sorry.
Yeah, that's very helpful, because a bulk of students want to do social media research, and it's around Twitter or Stina Weibo or WeChat or Facebook or Instagram. And so it's useful to know, because if they're going to convert their thesis into a journal article and they want to put a verbatim post in that, even if they don't mention the username or the handle of the person, someone could cut and paste that into a search and find that particular comment on Twitter. I'm assuming that's possible. So it really wouldn't be anonymous. And again, I'm just thinking against purely selfish thoughts, that looking at in the time frame in which the students have to do this work, that it's again a very close call to do any research that could potentially be published. That's now going to require more stringent approval processes. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just thinking from where I stand that I need to make students aware of all these possibilities and intricacies that they need to think through.
Yeah. I'll come back to just reminding students and everyone here that, we are talking about research with human beings, and there's as really clearly outlined in the 4 principles, there's a modicum of respect for the worth of human beings. So regardless of the fact that the data is free, we think it's freely available on Twitter, we're still working with human beings. So the principles of research, merit, integrity, respect, justice, and beneficence, do no harm, still sit there. Yeah, I think we have to just be reminded that, you know, I know that I'm not saying this is what social media research does, but I know in educational research, we often get applications from researchers who see classrooms like laboratory mines, data mines, because the children are captive audiences in a classroom and I can just go in and do whatever I like because they're just sitting there. And so we're trying to really shift people's perception of the people that we're working with and to really take on board those 4 principles.
Thank you.
You're on mute, Liz.
Oh, thank you. Isn't that the catch cry for 2020? I'm going to talk now very quickly about interview and focus group research. I know that many of us in our field will be doing this kind of work, myself included. And I guess, you know, the questions that sit in and around interviews and focus groups are similar. So we need to be always thinking about the beneficial consequences of the study. How will the study contribute to enhancing the situation of the person that I'm working with or the group that they represent to humanity? How are we going to make sure that we obtain informed consent from people before we start working with them? How much information do we need to give to people before they start speaking with us? And what could wait until after we finish the interview and there's a debriefing? Who's going to be giving consent to participate in an interview, depending on the age, the capacity of particular types of categories of participants? There's always the issue of confidentiality. There's always the issue of anonymity. And I know that often the question of anonymizing and de-identifying data in interviews, again, is quite specific depending on the discipline and the research project that you're working in. For example, in music, I know that oftentimes, and it could be the case in communication and the arts as well, you might be actually wanting to interview some really well-known composers. And this kind of blanket, everyone must be de-identified, perhaps doesn't work in that context, because maybe the composer wants people to know what they've said. They want people to hear their perspectives and their thoughts. So in relation to interviews and anonymity or de-identification, one of the things we're looking for more and more frequently is whether you're giving agency to a participant to make the call. And a person has agency once they've got informed consent. Which it relates to understanding what the study is, what their participation involves, what is the risk or the harm that I'm subjecting myself to, and am I prepared to do that? And if one of the risks is that their identity is known and you spell that out, a person is then given agency to make that call, whether they want to participate or not. There's also another issue in interviews around how you can conceal the identity of a person and take away all the identifying features. There's the issue of who's getting access to the interviews, the consequences if someone participates, and also that idea of your role as a researcher when you're interviewing someone. When we go to focus groups, all of those concerns sit there, but I guess we have it's a little bit more challenging because it's a group interview, and so issues of consent, confidentiality, and anonymity, and the risk of harm are slightly different when we're looking at focus group interview. And I guess the principal challenge in getting consent when you're looking at focus group research is making sure that a potential participant understands what's going to happen in the focus group. Because depending on the type of discussion and interaction that could take place, it could be quite unpredictable. You don't ever really know what's going to arise in a focus group and how participants are going to interact with one another. And so it could be difficult to achieve true informed consent in a focus group interview. And then also another problematic issue around consent might be the degree of disclosure that's possible in a focus group. In terms of confidentiality and anonymity issues, they're also potentially problematic because as a researcher, you have limited control over what people who've participated in a focus group might disclose and communicate outside of the group. And particularly if your group discussion encourages over disclosure, that could be even more difficult. So I guess one of the things to be aware of is that in any focus group, in participant information sheet and consent form, you need to have some understanding that there is the risk of disclosure, but that participants are agreeing, if they choose to participate, to remain, that what stays in the focus group remains there, and there's a confidentiality issue around what is discussed in that process. And of course, there's always the level of harm in a focus group is perhaps magnified depending on, particularly if you're working with a sensitive topic, disclosure of particular kinds of information related to a sensitive issue, and these all get amplified by the public nature of that discussion. And so I guess what needs to happen in all of these instances is that we need to get some kind of balance, and that there should be a balance in focus groups between avoiding or closing down potentially distressing discussion versus silencing voices of people who you would like to hear. I think this is one of the things that we often don't see addressed very well in ethical clearance applications are the particularities of harm, anonymity, and informed consent in focus group processes. So I really encourage you that if you are doing individual interviews as well as focus group interviews, that you pay attention to both and treat them as separate forms of data collection, much the same as you would a survey and an interview. And also we would suggest that you have a separate set of PICFs, participant information sheets and consent forms, for an interview and a focus group. And in relation to that, another way that we'd also like you to consider thinking around interviews is that there's the ethical concerns in relation to doing an interview or a focus group are a beginning to end and beyond kind of thinking process. So the ethical issues go beyond, they begin before the interview actually starts, and they go beyond the interview once it finishes. And so of course there's that question around what is the value if I interview this particular person, to the person themselves, their situation, their context, other people like them, and humanity as a whole. So the idea of thematizing is important. The next one, of course, is designing the project, and there should be, in the design of an interview study or a focus group study, it's the idea of informed consent needs to be built in from beginning to end. And one of the other things that we're looking for sometimes and more now is the idea of ongoing consent and capacity for people to have different points where you're renegotiating consent. So if any of you have completed the HREA, you'll notice that there's a question there. I can't remember off the top of my head which one it is, but there's that idea of, will participants get an opportunity to see interview transcripts, for example? And then there's a moment where the idea of negotiating ongoing consent is built into the application process. We're asking you to think around, is this a point where you could be asking a person, are you happy with, are you still consenting, giving consent to me to use the data as you've given it in an interview and now represented in a transcript? And so aside from all of that, there is the issue of the interaction that takes place in the interview situation itself. There are all kinds of things that can happen in interviews, as you might know if you've done them. It might be that someone discloses information that you weren't expecting and it's upsetting or distressing to you as a researcher, and vice versa, that you ask a question and a person, for example, gets upset and you weren't expecting it. And in terms of your thinking around the ethics, it's important to take into account how you might manage that situation and what are you going to ensure, what are you going to put in place to ensure that the interview does no harm. There's the issue of transcription and how you're going to transcribe and what do you include, what do you take out, and then the analysis of that, the verification, and of course the reporting. I've put protocols at the end as well, because when you apply for ethics, if you're doing interviews and focus groups, we'd like to see an interview protocol. So we do want to see the questions that you're planning on asking. This is really important. It just adds another layer of detail to what your project is, what you're trying to find out, and how you're thinking about the welfare of the people that you want to speak to. So make sure you include a protocol, an interview protocol. And typically for a semi-structured, I mean, often in our discipline, in HAS disciplines, we're doing open-ended semi-structured interviews. And so normally we would be wanting to see, around 10 different kinds of 10 questions, and the way you're going to proceed to ask people about the topic that you're interested in.
I just want to add to that, Liz. So in addition to what Liz just mentioned, even if you do a survey or an observation or whatsoever, you still need to submit it's either survey questions or observation protocols as well with your ethics application.
Thanks, Saruka. And I was just going to talk about that as well. So I guess, we do, particularly in ethnographic research, we do a lot of observation, and in educational research as well. There's a lot of observing that might take place in classrooms. And of course, what we want to be sure of at the ethical clearance level, or considering the ethics, is that you've really determined what you want to observe and why, and that you've got an established recording method, and that you've developed different questions and techniques around the observations that you want to do to ensure that they're most effective. And of course, what we also want to see again is that there's full consideration of the harm to participants in what you're doing. And so we also want to make sure that the way that you're observing and taking notes, analysing behaviours, etc., has some kind of rigorous research approach to it. So Taruk is absolutely right. If you're doing observations of any kind, whether it's ethnographic research or not, we do want to see an observation protocol. So this means that we're very clear then about who you're looking at, how you're looking at them, and why, and that there's consistency across the different types of sites and settings and people that you'll be working with. So I think I have an example. This is a very kind of, I want to say formulaic, though that's probably not quite the right word. But this is an example of an observation protocol where you're looking at behaviour of students in a classroom. So you can see this would be specifically to particular individual students. And you can see that it's very clear from this protocol what it is a researcher is actually looking at. So this is what we would expect to see as a protocol, because the rest of the detail should be there. We know what your research questions are. We know the kinds of participants that you're working with. This is just telling us how you're going to be looking at them and how you're going to be collecting the data around that. This is an example which you would probably think of as more as an ethnographic observation. But you can see that, again, there's quite specific information around who you're looking at, why you're looking at it, and a particular kind of context. This is about train travellers and what goes on in between getting on and getting off trains, or getting onto a train. So it's really up to you, and we don't advise you on the type of detail that's in a research observation protocol, but we do need to see it. So just keep that one in mind. I do want to talk about ethics and autoethnography. We do see this cropping up quite a bit. Autoethnography, for those of you who are aware, is kind of the new kid on the block. Every single person wants to do an autoethnography, but just to briefly point you to the fact that autoethnography is it's not a self-study. It's always about the social, so there's always an other in autoethnographic work. If someone is simply wanting to observe themselves, it's not autoethnography. It's something else. It could be self-study or autobiography, for example. So in doing autoethnographic work, in the thinking, the writing, the researching and returning knowledge, there is always an other. So that means there's an ethics of relationality there, and the principles of informed consent, anonymity and privacy all still apply. So if you are doing an autoethnographic project, or you're calling it autoethnography, then you do need an ethics application because it will always involve someone else. And I could probably, I could talk a lot about that, but I think that's probably enough said. Just be really clear about your understanding of what autoethnography is and whether it actually applies to your study before you put it in. Okay, how are we going for time? All right, so some of you would be familiar with the HREA form. Here's some information about it. The link that you see there, the www.hrea.gov, that's the entry point into applying. And I know that a lot of people get very frustrated with this form. It's quite a bit different to the forms that many of us used to be familiar with, but just be in mind that it's really asking us to, giving us the best chance as reviewing bodies to assess the 4 principles of the national statement and in relation to research. That's what we're really looking for. And this form is definitely, I think, a lot more concise and streamlined for efficient and effective ethics review. There's a bit of a misunderstanding that this form was done by medical researchers, representatives from the Academy of the Humanities and the Social Sciences also had input into the design of the HREA. So it is absolutely set up to look after social science and humanities researchers as well. Everybody fills out the same HREA form, regardless of whether it's LNR or a high-risk application. The only difference is that it goes to, it gets emailed to a different place. I'm just having a look with a chat. Okay. Yes, very happy to present on autoethnography. As some of you would know, that's my bread and butter as a researcher, so I'm more than happy to do that. Okay, so there's 7 elements in the HREA I just want to alert you to. So this is what you can be prepared for. First of all, you're going to be asked to talk about the research scope, aims, themes, questions and methods. You're going to be asked to tell us about recruitment, consent, the use and collection, use and management of data and information, communication of research findings or results to participants, the dissemination of research outputs and outcomes, and also what's going to happen after the project. So these are the kinds of things that the questions that you're asked on the HREA are absolutely looking for. Okay, common pitfalls. Please jump in, Tharuka. Tharuka and the team in the Office of Research Ethics have put together a fantastic list of specific things that we see, and there are particular questions, for example, that we always get confusion over, and I'll point to some of them, but I know that the Office of Research Ethics is looking at putting a document and perhaps a video out about this. So I'll just first of all talk to the project team. This is something that we see all of the time. We absolutely need to make sure that the chief investigator is listed first. If it's a student project, the principal advisor, supervisor must be listed first in the application. Now this is, I know there's a little bit of confusion around this, but at the moment, Tharuka and the team in the Office of Research Ethics and those of us reviewing, this is what we're looking for. Because then what we can see is very, very clearly who's involved in this project, who's involved in taking care of the research student and ensuring that they're being trained and guided appropriately in the ethical clearance application process. Please be aware that if it's a student's project, the student doesn't have the authorization to sign the application. The chief investigator, which is the principal advisor, must sign the application. So just keep in mind, we see that all of the time as a problem. The next thing is the setting of the research. we often see people who are not aware that if you're actually working across different contexts, different sites, different locations, we need to make sure that if you've indicated that in question 1.4, that you replicate that in question 1.15. So just, I guess some of the things that I'm talking about here are really specific to the detail that you provide for us. Okay, consent questions. So this is perhaps related to what you were asking earlier, Kelly, is, there's different levels of consent. Implied consent would mean not written or verbal, and an example of that is definitely online survey research, is that people, unless otherwise stated, are giving their consent. If you click the button to submit, you've given your consent. And I guess it's making the argument as well for social media research, how that's implied. I've talked a little bit as well around confirming or renegotiating consent. For example, we may not necessarily expect one-off data collection activities to have renegotiating consent, but there are some aspects that maybe we would be gesturing towards you taking that on board as a serious consideration in terms of upholding the principle of respect for human participants. If it's a longitudinal study, for example, obviously renegotiating consent is probably important, or if you're going back to interview people a number of times, ongoing consent renegotiation would be important. The other one that's popping up a little bit is whether or not you can adopt an opt-out approach to consent, which means that unless participants tell you otherwise, they're automatically in the study. There's a section in the national statement which, if you are going to ask for opt-out consent, you've got to explain to us why you think you should have it. This is treated really, really seriously because the principle of informed consent is so important to ethics that we take that on board and look at it very, very closely if anyone is asking for opt-out approach. It is possible. It's not, doesn't happen often, but just to be aware that we need all of the detail. In relation to data and privacy, you might sometimes be collecting information that's considered personable, which means that it will which means it will make the information and the participant identifiable. But if you're not using this information, so if you're using pseudonyms or de-identifying them, the most appropriate answer is to say non-personal information. Of course, that does vary across participant groups as well, but again, a bit of a case by case, but just think about that in terms of how you're using the information in the long term. So the last thing I'll talk about are the attachments and declarations. So please make sure when you put your ethical clearance application in that we have a project description. Now, this is not the same as a grant proposal and not the same as a confirmation document. It can be very close, but it has a slightly different format, and the Office of Research Ethics has a template for that and suggested subheadings that we'd like you to follow. The project description is used by ethics reviewers to add the detail that's not possible and to double check that we've understood the way you've responded to questions. So another thing to be aware of is that we really need you to be cross-checking that what you have in your HREA form and the application form itself is replicated in the protocol or the project description that you submit, as well as your participant information sheet and consent forms. I've talked already about having, we need to see observation protocols and guides, as well as sample interview focus group and survey questions as part of your application. And we do need the set of participant information sheets and consent forms to be submitted as well. Depending on the type of data that you're collecting and the methods, we usually, it's easier for us to assess those if you submit a separate one for each type of data collection method as a general rule. Just to remind you as well that the participant information sheet absolutely has to be in everyday language. A bit of a behind the scenes bit of information that as reviewers, particularly at central level, on our reviewing committee, we have a lot of people who look at applications who are not researchers. They don't have the, the knowledge and the speak and the discourses and performativities that we have as researchers. So one of the things that we look at when we're first reviewing an application is we go directly to the participant information sheet, because we want to get a very quick summary of what this project is, what are people being asked to do, and what are the levels of harm that sit here.
Just to add to that, Liz, so if you, in the UQ website itself, you can find templates and a checklist when you're doing the consent forms and the participant information sheets. So that will be very helpful if you can just follow that. And I just want to add another thing, Liz. When it comes to common pitfalls, one of the main things we have seen is one of the questions about human beings via active participation or just using their data. So when it comes to that, we have seen a lot of people, if you're doing interviews or surveys, a lot of people seem to tick data associated with human beings instead of choosing via active participation. So that's wrong, because you have to choose active participation if you're interviewing or surveying, or basically if you interact with human beings. Because what happens in the online application is that if you choose the wrong option, the questions that is generated afterwards is not the same as what will be generated if you choose the right answer. Then we have to get back to you and ask you to amend the online application again and answer the rest of the questions as well. So just to cut short and just to make sure that it's efficient and time efficient, your ethics application, just make sure if it's interacting with any human being, you just need to select human beings via active participation.
Thanks, Tharuka. So the pitfalls are the things that we see that will hold up your application. So it's important to get some of these things right before it even goes out for review. I'm aware that time is moving on. So what I think I'd like to do just to finish up is I'd like to share with you our top 10 tips from this is from HREC-B, and I'll just quickly show you the video. I'm not sure, Tharuka and I have developed a feedback form, and we'd really love to hear from you about what you found useful, maybe what you didn't find so useful, but also particular topics that you'd like us to address in the future. So we'll share that with you.
Chat itself, so they can complete the survey too. Shall we just do that?
Yeah, let's do that if we can share that in the chat.
Just do that.
For example, talking about participant information sheets and consent forms and talking through some examples would probably be quite useful, but I think we've run out of time for that today. So here's our top 10 tips. We had a bit of fun putting this together. So what did the other chair of HREC-A and I say, why shouldn't ethics be enjoyable? So the ethics committees also hold to that view. So let me just share the screen with you. And my apologies to the School of Communication and the Arts people. This is no, this is no masterpiece by any means. Sorry, I'll just make sure I share the sound. Bear with me, sorry. While I'm trying to sort this out, I don't know what's happened. Please ask me any questions.
Yes, I'd just like to thank you very much for that excellent presentation. I've learned a lot. And you might have seen in some of the chats that the School of Music is particularly interested in the autoethnographic area. So we might have a great meeting of minds at a later time when we can persuade you to come and join us. There are numerous perspectives we'd like to consider here. There's the students, the advisors, assessors, and examiners, who shouldn't be forgotten as well. And we have so many honours and postgraduate projects in our school that are taking on this research approach.
Yeah, I'm really very happy to do that.
Thanks, Liz. I think that was really I found it really helpful, and I think, you know, in terms of the overview, but also the specifics. So thanks so much. That was great, and it's great that we've got the recording as well that we can share. Yeah,
no problem. All right, I think I've got my technology sorted. We'll give it a shot, hey?
Hi everyone, my name's Liz McKinlay and I'm the chair of the House LNR Ethics Committee and also chair of HREC at central level. What I'd like to do is provide you with our top 10 tips for completing your ethics application put together by members of HREC. We thought about all the applications that we look at and some of the things that we would really like to see to improve the quality of your application and to make sure that we approve your application as quickly and as efficiently as possible. When you're responding to the HREA, what we would like you to keep in mind are the 4 ethical principles in the national statement. The 4 ethical principles are research merit and integrity, respect, beneficence and justice. It's really important that you think about the ways that these apply to each and every question, and keep in mind that the HREC uses these as a criteria to review your application and to make a decision on approval. Our second tip is to think about keeping your written as simple as possible. Keep it clear, keep it concise and precise. We know that we need to have a lot of detail, but try to think about ways in which you can make it as readable as possible for us on the committee so that we can ascertain what's going on, how you're going to do your research and what the ethical considerations are that we need to take into account when we're looking at your application. Please make sure that you carefully cross-check and proofread your application for consistency, grammar and spelling mistakes before it's signed and sent in. This is really important because we often have a lot of applications to review at each and every meeting. We have a lot of pages to read, thinking about readability and making it as easy as possible for us to access the information without getting too caught up in grammar, typos and other things that make it difficult for us to see the wood for the trees would be fantastic. Tip number 4, each and every question on the HREA form is different, and what we would like you to do is read each question carefully, apply the 4 principles and think about what each and every question is asking you to do and to take into account in relation to the ethics. Cutting and pasting from other questions is not really answering the question, and is it going to make it possible for us to assess your application adequately. Remember that all we have when we look at your application is what you provide to us. So I can't emphasize enough how much detail is important. Tell us everything. Tell us exactly what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. We need as much detail as possible to be able to assess your application fairly. In relation to the details as well, we'd like you to really make sure that everything is adding up. If you say, for example, in your application that a participant will be asked for consent to retain a recording, make sure that is actually what is replicated in the consent form and the participant information sheet. Tip number 6 is to contact the ethics office, seek their advice early on and take their suggestions on board seriously. Our wonderful team in the ethics office, they're experts, they look at ethics applications every day, and asking them for advice and taking it on board will help to expedite your approval to avoid delaying your research projects to begin. Consider having a friend who knows nothing about your area of research read your application. Does it make sense to them? Tip number 8, related to tip number 7, imagine yourself being the participant and what the experience will be like. This might help you to identify whether the assessments and the measures requested of the participant are reasonable and acceptable. Our number 9 tip is to consider reading an approved ethics application before writing your own to get a feel of the information that needs to be provided in relation to the study protocol and the participant information sheets. If you do that, it'll make it a lot easier for you to think about the ethical considerations in relation to your own project and how you're going to express those clearly and concisely to the HREC committee. Our final tip is remember that the ethics committees are not trying to make life difficult for researchers or to be obstructionists, but what we do have is a responsibility to consider the welfare of both participants and the researchers, as well as the broader community. I hope these top 10 tips have been useful for you. Stay tuned because we hope in the future to be able to provide you with similar tips and advice as you move through applying for ethics.
Well, thank you, everyone. I know we've been sitting here for an hour and a half. Always very, very happy to talk about ethics. There's always a lot to say. And as I mentioned earlier, it is a very rapidly changing landscape, and it's important for us to have ongoing conversations. So thank you. And I'll see you for our next session, or maybe see an application from you. And Tharuka and the Office of Research Ethics, as well as myself, always happy to answer any questions or to have a conversation if you have them.
Thanks, everyone. And please, if you have time, just fill the survey as well, so that it'll help us to get more feedback and develop and enhance our sessions in future as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz.
Thank you, Tharuka.
Thanks, everyone, for attending.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you very much, Tharuka, as well.
Thank you.